time for the news.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, today starts a working visit to Turkey, during which he is expected to co-chair with his Turkish counterpart the second session of the Algerian-Turkish Joint Planning Commission. And the Sahrawi President and Secretary General of the Polisario Front, Brahim Ghali, highlighted the contributions of his country to the preservation of the environment while underlining the practices of the Moroccan occupier in the occupied Sahrawi territories. And the landmark African Climate Summit ended today, Wednesday, after leaders adopted a joint Nairobi declaration aiming to highlight the continent's potential as a green powerhouse. And those were the major developments. Now the full news edition. Good afternoon. On the instruction of the President of the Republic, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmed Attaf, today starts a working visit to Turkey. During his visit, the Minister will co-chair the second session of the Algerian-Turkish Joint Planning Commission with his Turkish counterpart, Hakan Fidan. The meeting will be attended by the Algerian delegation made up of representatives from 12 ministerial sectors, including those responsible for monitoring the implementation and materialization of the various bilateral cooperation programs between Algeria and Turkey. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ahmed Attaf, has received a phone conversation from the British Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Lord Tariq Ahmed, with whom he discussed cooperation and coordination between the two countries. On this occasion, the two parties reviewed the relations of cooperation and coordination between Algeria and Britain, notably in anticipation of Algeria's accession to the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member from next year, and the preparations for the next session of the British-Algerian Strategic Dialogue scheduled for November in London. And now to Western Sahara. The President of Western Sahara and Secretary General of the Polisario Front, Brahim Ghali, highlighted before the participants in the African Climate Summit held in the Kenyan capital Nairobi the contribution of his country to the preservation of the environment.
In an address to the summit, the Sahrawi president spoke of the Sahrawi Republic's policy on the green economy and the approach adopted in the fight against climate change, noting that his country, which is facing the challenges inherent in climate change, is at the same time waging a relentless struggle to put an end to the colonization of his territories. For the Sahrawi president, the practices of the Moroccan occupier in the occupied territories of the Sahrawi Republic, carried out in violation of international law, only accentuate the impacts of climate change, namely colonization, industrialization, and the development of mechanisms for plundering fisheries and depleting water and agricultural resources for exports. The wall of shame built by the Moroccan army of occupation, which divides Western Sahara into two parts, deprives the liberated territories of the Sahrawi Republic of its waters, which constitutes a dangerous environmental degradation that increases the effects of the drought that the region is suffering, causing profound changes to the surface of the earth, which is now more exposed to wind erosion and water stagnation, said the Sahrawi president. The areas adjacent to the wall that have been mined by the occupying forces are uninhabitable and have limited economic productivity. All these challenges require measures to be taken on the ground to confront the prevailing status quo, continued Brahim Ghali, who highlighted the Sahrawi Republic's contribution to defining urgent measures to adapt to climate change and reduce its impact by stepping up the development of renewable energy to replace fossil fuels. He also referred to the pilot projects to connect the liberated Sahrawi territories to the electricity grid using solar and wind energy, including solar-powered water pumps to preserve animal and agricultural resources. Solar energy systems will also be set up to strengthen medical facilities in remote areas.
And still with the Western Sahara issue, the Polisario Front's representative in Switzerland and to the UN and international organizations in Geneva, Ubi Bushraya Bashir, has said that the Morocco's repression of demonstrators under the eyes of the UN Secretary General's personal envoy for Western Sahara, Staffan de Mistura, who has been visiting occupied Laayoune since Monday, was intended to send a clear message that the conflict in Western Sahara was still going on. On Monday, Moroccan occupying forces repressed a peaceful sit-in organized by Sahrawi human rights associations in the occupied city of Laayoune. And the landmark African Climate Summit ended today, Wednesday, after leaders adopted a joint Nairobi declaration aiming to highlight the continent's potential as a green powerhouse. After 2 days of extensive deliberations around the devastating impacts of climate change across the continent and globally, African political and business leaders in Kenya have adopted Nairobi declaration to raise $23 billion for green growth, mitigation and adaptation to address climate challenges in Africa. The declaration was announced by Kenya's President William Ruto and adopted by African heads of state and government in the presence of global leaders and high-level representatives at the closing plenary of the summit on Wednesday in Kenya.
We demand a fair playing ground for our countries to access the investment needed to unlock the potential and translate it into opportunities. We further demand a just multilateral development finance architecture to liberate our economies from odious debt and onerous barriers to necessary financial resources. We are clear in our minds and hearts that the international community must walk with us in this journey into a future of prosperity and security in an ecologically balanced, thriving planet. We are therefore determined to have difficult conversations, take hard decisions, and make uncomfortable changes to set international consensus on an Afrocentric and globally inclusive path into an African future.
Meanwhile, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the people of Africa need action to respond to deadly climate extremes.
One of the prime injustices is what brings me to Nairobi today, climate chaos. Africa accounts for just 4% of global emissions, but it suffers some of the worst effects of climate change. Today, I renewed my call for the world to step up climate action to avoid the worst effects of climate change, keep global promises to provide essential support, and help Africa make a just and equitable transition to renewable energy. As I detailed in my remarks, Africa can be a renewable energy superpower. Now is the time to bring together African countries with developed countries, financial institutions and technological companies to create a true African renewable energy alliance. And all of that requires addressing another injustice, an outdated, unfair and dysfunctional global financial system.
The Secretary General made a strong appeal for large emitters, namely the G20 countries, that are meeting in New Delhi this week to commit to reaching net zero emissions as close as possible to 2040. And in Libya, the head of the National Unity Government, Abdelhamid Dbeiba, has received the UN envoy to Libya, Abdullah Batili, at the Prime Minister's office in Tripoli to discuss developments in the political situation in the country. During the meeting, the UN envoy briefed the Prime Minister on the results of his meetings with the various political parties during his recent tour, in which he stressed the need to create appropriate conditions for holding elections as soon as possible. And still in Africa and in Burkina Faso, 53 soldiers were killed on Monday in a terrorist attack in the northern province of Yatinga. The army announced on Tuesday, claiming to have eliminated several dozens of terrorists. According to the army statement, the attack, which took place in the locality of Kumbri, also left around 30 soldiers wounded. And prisoners were released in Gabon on Tuesday following a promise made by the previous day. The two prisoners of conscience by the president of the transition. He received 6 days after his coup, the head of state of the General African Republic, who had been sent as a regional facilitator. You still listen to Radio Algeria International, and the 78th session of the United Nations General Assembly was kicked off by the UN President of the General Assembly, Denis Francis. Denis Francis, President of the 78th session of the General Assembly, delivers his inaugural address at the opening of the session. In his speech, he expresses gratitude for the opportunity to serve as President and outlines his vision for the session. President Francis emphasizes that this presidency will be guided by the values of tolerance, inclusion, cooperation, and respect for human dignity.
We begin the 78th session of the General Assembly amid a daunting global agenda, beset by a series of cascading challenges. I have set out 4 priorities, 4 watchwords, to ensure the 78th session meaningfully addresses these challenges: peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability. This session, I will commit to engaging in regional and other groups to collectively collaborate to bring to life a renewed atmosphere of global cooperation and shared commitments. My ambition is for the General Assembly to address the array of challenges it faces in the most effective and inclusive way possible.
And in an opening speech read on his behalf by his deputy Amina Mohammed, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned of the divisions and profound global challenges that are currently putting the United Nations to a severe test. She commended the stewardship of its president, adding that the 77th session of the General Assembly has kept diplomacy, dialogue, and debate alive and worked towards real solutions for people and planet alike.
The last year has been another challenging one for human family. From conflicts and rising geopolitical mistrust to heat waves, fires, and melting sea ice caused by climate chaos, to rising poverty, inequality, discrimination, and injustice. Throughout it all, the 77th session of the GA has kept diplomacy, dialogue, and debate alive and worked towards real solutions for people and planet alike. At every step, this Assembly has benefited from the stewardship of the President of the 77th session, His Excellency Csaba Kőrösi of Hungary, who has presided over this session with consummate skill and stewardship. His leadership has exemplified his commitment to solutions through solidarity, sustainability, and science, including his advocacy of science-based validation of sustainability investments.
And President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly addressed the closing meeting of the 77th session of the General Assembly. He said our survival depends on our cooperation.
I'm proud to stand before you for the last meeting of the 77th session of the General Assembly. I want to leave you with 5 main thoughts. The first is that despite geopolitical rivalries, our survival depends on our cooperation. We have ample scientific evidence that we are well in the Anthropocene era, an age marked by humans' decisive impact on the planet. At the beginning of my turn, I invited you to view our work through the lenses of crisis management and the sustainability transformation. Such an approach could allow us to counter the global crises of our own making. Geopolitical rivalries are part of the reality. But let us not forget, they block many prospects of the necessary solutions and urgent cooperation.
The 77th session of the UN General Assembly on Tuesday concluded with the outgoing president calling for cooperation on a global scale. 14 hours 44 minutes Algeria's time. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Kiev for an unannounced visit that is his first for a year to the Ukrainian capital. Blinken will meet his Ukrainian counterpart Dmytro Kuleba and the President Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, 16 people were killed in a Russian attack in the east. And member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have said that they are working on building an environment-friendly economic bloc. Jamal Salmani.
Speaking on Tuesday at the ASEAN Climate Forum held on the sidelines of the 43rd Bloc Summit, the Indonesian Minister of Coordination of Economic Affairs, Airlangga Hartarto, noted that the Southeast Asia region will be affected by climate change and could lose around 30% of its GDP by 2050 due to rising global temperatures and weather extremes. Hartarto said, therefore, greenhouse gas emissions in Southeast Asia must be reduced by 10 to 25% by 2030 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, explaining that to do this, joint cooperation between the government and the private sector is now necessary. The use of electric transport and renewable energies will be also essential for the region to be able to respect its commitments in terms of decarbonization. Furthermore, the official recalled that ASEAN countries have agreed to develop an ecosystem of electric vehicles and to become an important part of the global supply chain. The development of electric vehicles that can play a major role in environmental sustainability by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and accelerating the transition energy by decarbonizing the land transport sector to achieving zero emissions and increasing safe energy in the region. Officials who took part in the forum also agreed to explore cooperation and collaboration in terms of development of the electric vehicle ecosystem. Cooperation includes improving infrastructure and charging stations, the creation of a trade environment and a favorable environment for investments, and the encouragement of public-private partnerships. The participants also focused on implementing strategic ideas and a global vision concerning the reduction of emissions, affordable energy transition, strategies for decarbonization and sustainable financing.
14 hours, 47 minutes, Algiers time. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International. And to the burning Middle East file, the occupation of the West Bank is illegal under international law, according to a new report commissioned by the United Nations, calling for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal from the Palestinian territory. The details with Said Bouazi.
The 2023 annual report commissioned by the United Nations Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People concludes that the conditions required for the occupation to be considered illegal are met by the Zionist entity, which has notably annexed parts of the occupied territory, violated the rights of the occupied populations, and implemented practices of apartheid. Because the occupation is illegal, the consequences should be the complete, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal of the military forces, the settlers, the repeal of all discriminatory laws, and the dismantling of the military administrative regime, said Michael Link, former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, to the committee while presenting the report. The actions of the occupation remained largely unchecked by the international community, a situation denounced before the Commission by the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations. This report follows on from other United Nations reports that have criticized the occupying power. In March 2022, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories presented a report concluding that the situation in the occupied territories was akin to apartheid. The latest report echoes these conclusions, highlighting the confiscation of Palestinian land and the denial of the right of return of 7 million Palestinian refugees to their land. The permanent representative of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, Riyad Mansour, hailed the report as an extremely powerful, solid and well-documented legal argument on the occupation, adding that it contributed to the very strong legal argument that the Palestinians have presented to the International Court of Justice in order to free themselves from this diabolical system of occupation.
And still with the Middle East issue, the Palestinian government has called on the international community to put pressure on the Zionist entity to reopen the Karam Abu Salam terminal in the Gaza Strip to exports. This is according to a press release issued by the Palestinian Minister of National Economy. And 14 hours for 40 or 50 minutes, Algiers time is listening to Radio Algeria International, and time now for the headlines. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Community Abroad, Ahmad Attaf, today starts a working visit to Turkey. The Sahrawi President and Secretary General of the Polisario Front, Brahim Ghali, highlighted the contributions of his country to the preservation of the environment. And the landmark African Climate Summit ended today, Wednesday, after leaders adopted a joint Nairobi declaration aiming to highlight the continent's potential as a green powerhouse. And that's it, dear listeners, for our news bulletin. I invite you now to listen to a cultural program presented by Jamer Salmani.
Welcome to your weekly program, Destination Algeria. I'm Jamal Samani. There are a number of great destinations in Algeria just waiting to be discovered. A curious mixture of cultures and influences. Algeria has something interesting to see in just about every city. The country is also the first largest on the African continent, so you can be sure that there are plenty of towns and cities to visit. Let's visit Algeria's fascinating destinations, you and I, together. The music genre mostly readily associated with modern-day Algeria is that of Rai, derived from the folk music of Bedouin shepherd in Oran and blended with aspects of French, Spanish, African, and Arab music. But other genres of music are also popular in this fascinating North African country, including that of ancient Andalusian classical music, enjoyed mainly in Algeria and southern Spain, with similar musical traditions found in Libya and Tunisia, what it is also referred to as El Malouf. Algerian Shabi music, which is formalized by renowned musician El-Hajj Mohamed Al-Anqa from the city of Algiers, incorporates distinctive characteristics of Andalusian classical music. While there is a certain amount of disagreement among scholars as to the exact origins of Andalusian classical music, the most widely accepted theory is that it originated in the 9th century in the region then known as Al-Andalus, or Moorish Iberia, ruled by the Caliphate of Cordoba. Some claim that the Persian musician Zeryeb, who was the court musician of the Caliphate of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman II, was the composer of the first Andalusian classical music, with Andalusian poet and composer Ibn Jaffa later combining Zeryeb's compositions with his own style of music, which was later spread across North Africa. Wherever the genre's origins, once it reached North Africa, Andalusian classical music was carefully guarded from changes by both Muslim and Jewish musicians who wanted to maintain the pure form of the music as they had first heard it. In his book entitled Jews of Andalusia and the Maghreb, author Haim Zafani notes that they were ardent maintainers of Andalusian music and zealous guardians of its old traditions. The 11th and 13th century traditions of troubadours, traveling musicians telling stories in song, are believed to have been inspired by Andalusian classical music. Today, there are Andalusian classical music orchestras to be found in the Algerian cities of Tlemcen, Algiers, Blida, Bijaya, Constantine, and Oran, all dedicated to preserving the traditions of this ancient style of music. In the second part, we invite you to visit with us the city of Souk-Ahras. The city of Souk-Ahras in Algeria is the capital of the Souk-Ahras province and is located in the border of Algeria and the neighboring Tunisia. It is a city that is home to a distinguished history and is associated with a famous figure, namely Saint Augustin of Hippo. The city is filled with the legacy of a settlement that once graced the site on which Souk-Ahras was built, the remembrances of the Algerian War, and the bravery of the people of Souk-Ahras who weathered the storms to create a quaint but successful place they call home. Before their complete extinction in 1930, Barbary lions once roamed freely in the dense forests surrounding the city, with the city being a well-known marketplace, also referred to as a souk. The city was christened Souk-Ahras, meaning Market of Lions. Today, the magnificent forests can still be enjoyed, and even without the majestic king of the forest walking around, the forests are home to many wildlife species and breathtaking birds. Most people view the city merely as a stop en route to Tunisia, unaware of the heritage of the city. Long before the city was constructed, an ancient city by the name of Tagaste flourished here. And it is in this city that Saint Augustin of Hippo was born in the year 354. He went on to serve to the monastery of Tagaste, as did other well-known men such as Saint Alepius, Saint Firmus, and Saint Januarius. It is believed that the city of Tagaste was in existence until the year 600. Historians suspect that life in Tagaste was much like Souk-Ahras is now. Bustling with markets selling leather, bread, wine, and fruit, with the forest supplying them with needed building materials and wood for hand-carved furniture. The city has grown into a vibrant industrial and agricultural center, with cattle farming, mining, and spectacular vineyards decorating the landscapes. For visitors who want to travel to Souk-Ahras, there are a few noteworthy sites to visit, such as ancient Christian monuments and the basilica ruins that have been excavated. Mining and the railway has brought an economic boost for the city and has supplied the city with adequate transport to move products. Even though the city has embraced change and modernization of its industries, it has managed to retain its friendly and small village atmosphere.